divine echoes in suffering, finding God's voice in pain. There's a moment that comes to nearly everyone. You're lying awake at 3 a.m, and the pain, whether it's physical, emotional, or something you can't even name, feels so overwhelming that you wonder if God has forgotten your name. But here's what researchers studying the neuroscience of suffering have discovered that changes everything. The human brain processes profound pain and profound spiritual connection in remarkably similar regions, which means the very moment you feel most abandoned might be the exact moment something is trying to reach you. What I'm about to share with you isn't comfortable, and it definitely isn't what you'll hear in most places, but it might be the most important thing you hear all year. Let me take you back to 1961, to a psychiatric hospital in Vienna. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who had lost everything, is treating a patient who asks him the question that haunts millions. Why does God allow such terrible suffering? Frankl doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he tells the patient about something he observed in the concentration camp, something that made no logical sense, but changed how he understood everything about human existence and pain. He noticed that the prisoners who survived longest weren't always the strongest or the healthiest. They were the ones who found meaning in their suffering, not justification for it, not explanation, meaning. And here's where it gets interesting. Those prisoners reported experiencing what they could only describe as a presence in their darkest moments, a whisper beneath the screaming, an echo of something beyond themselves. Now you might be thinking, that's just survival instinct, or the mind creates comfort when it needs to. And maybe you're right. But before you decide, consider this. A study published in the Journal of Positive Psychology in 2018 analyzed over 3,000 testimonies from people who experienced what they categorized as severe life crises, terminal diagnoses, loss of children, devastating accidents. 67% reported what they described as divine communication or spiritual awareness that only emerged during their darkest periods, not before, not after, during. The research team, led by Dr. Sarah Chun at Stanford, found something even more puzzling. These individuals showed measurably better recovery outcomes, not because they were more religious going into the crisis, but because they learned to listen differently when everything else went silent. But here's what nobody talks about. What does that even mean? Listen differently? I spent 2 years interviewing people for a project I never expected to do. It started when my own father was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Watching him go through treatment, I kept hearing him say something that unsettled me. I'm hearing things I should have heard years ago, not voices, not hallucinations. He described it as clarity emerging through the static of normal life, the constant noise of ambition, fear, routine, and distraction that usually drowns out something quieter underneath. One night, about 3 months before he died, I asked him what he meant. He looked at me and said, "Pain strips away everything that doesn't matter. And when all that's gone, there's something else there. It's been there the whole time. You just couldn't hear it through everything else." That conversation sent me down a path I didn't expect. I wanted to know if this was unique to him or if there was something deeper happening that we systematically miss because we're so focused on escaping pain that we never stop to ask what it might be revealing. Here's what I found. The medieval mystics had a concept they called the dark night of the soul. We've turned it into a cliché now, something people say when they're having a bad week. But the original meaning was far more specific and far more radical. John of the Cross, who coined the phrase in the 16th century, described it as a period of profound spiritual desolation, where God withdraws all consolation, not as punishment, but as preparation. He claimed that the soul could only perceive certain truths about the divine in complete darkness, the same way your eyes can only see certain stars when every other light is extinguished. Modern psychology has started catching up to something similar. Dr. Lisa Miller, a clinical psychologist at Columbia University, has spent 15 years studying what she calls awakening through adversity. Her research shows that the human brain undergoes measurable changes during periods of intense suffering. Specifically, regions associated with self-transcendence and perception beyond the ego show increased activity. She found that people who engage with their suffering rather than purely trying to escape it develop what she describes as spiritual awareness circuits that remain heightened even after the crisis passes. But here's the part that made me stop everything and reconsider what I thought I knew about suffering. Miller's team discovered that these changes don't happen automatically. It's not just about going through hard times. Millions of people experience terrible suffering and come out of it no more spiritually aware than before, sometimes less so, hardened and closed off. The difference wasn't in the suffering itself. It was in what the person chose to do in the middle of it. The ones who experienced this awakening did something counterintuitive. Instead of asking, "Why me?" or "When will this end?" both completely natural questions, they eventually shifted to a different question. What am I supposed to understand from this? That shift changed everything. Here's what nobody prepares you for about suffering. The temptation isn't just to give up, it's to waste it. To go through something terrible and learn nothing, grow in no way, discover nothing about yourself or existence or whatever might lie beyond it. That's the real tragedy, not the pain itself, but the pain that produces nothing. I talked to a woman named Rachel who lost her daughter in a car accident when the girl was only 7 years old. She told me something I'll never forget. For the first year I was drowning. I wasn't even asking questions. I was just trying to survive each day. But somewhere around month 14, I realized that I had a choice. I could let this destroy me, or I could let it reveal something. I didn't know what. I just knew that if I was going to carry this weight for the rest of my life, it had to mean something beyond just pain. So she started doing something unusual. Every morning she would sit in silence for 20 minutes and ask out loud, "What are you trying to show me?" She wasn't sure who she was asking. God, the universe, her own deeper consciousness. She didn't have the theological precision to define it. She just asked. For months, nothing. Just silence and tears. Then one morning she said something answered. Not in words. She described it as a knowing that suddenly appeared in her mind, fully formed. You're learning to love without possession. You're learning that love doesn't end when presence ends. You're learning what most people never understand until it's too late. Rachel told me she broke down crying, but not from sadness, from recognition. Something in those words felt more true than anything she'd ever been told in any church, any therapy session, any well-meaning condolence. It felt like communication from somewhere beyond herself, and it came directly through the wound that had nearly destroyed her. That's the echo. That's what the mystics and the scientists and the survivors keep pointing toward. The Catholic theologian Henry Nouwen wrote something in his book, The Wounded Healer, that neuroscience is now confirming. Nobody escapes being wounded. We are all wounded people. The main question is not, how can we hide our wounds? So we don't have to be embarrassed, but how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers. But there's something deeper here that Nouwen hints at, but doesn't fully explain. What if the wound itself becomes the receiver? What if pain, by breaking us open, creates the very opening through which something divine can finally enter? Think about it this way. When you're comfortable, successful, surrounded by love, moving through life with relative ease, you're not exactly seeking. You're managing. You're maintaining. You're existing in the world you've built for yourself. And that world, however nice it might be, has walls, assumptions, certainties, a sense of control that's mostly an illusion, but an effective one. Suffering demolishes those walls, not gently, not with wisdom or preparation. It just smashes through everything you thought was solid, and suddenly you're standing in the rubble of your previous understanding of how life works, how God works, how anything works. And in that exposure, that radical vulnerability, you become permeable to something you couldn't access before. The Trappist monk Thomas Merton described it like this: there is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a fountain of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being. But then he adds the crucial part. This is what all people experience when the walls of themselves are broken down. There's a reason the most profound spiritual experiences in human history happen in caves, in deserts, in prisons, in sickness, in loss, not because God prefers misery, but because those are the places where we finally stop talking, stop planning, stop performing, and start listening. I'm not saying suffering is good. I'm not saying God causes it to teach us lessons like some cosmic sadist. That theology is poison, and it's caused immeasurable harm. But I'm saying this: if suffering is inevitable, and it absolutely is, then the question becomes whether we'll let it speak or whether we'll spend all our energy trying to silence it with distraction, substances, denial, or bitterness. Because here's what I discovered in those interviews, in that research, in watching my father die and hearing what he heard in those final months. Suffering that's engaged with becomes a language. And once you learn to understand that language, you start recognizing that it's been trying to tell you something all along. Not an explanation, not a justification, but a call. An invitation to know something that can't be known any other way. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. He meant it literally. The psychological and spiritual development that most people say they want, the depth, the wisdom, the authentic connection to something transcendent, doesn't come through happy circumstances. It comes through being broken down to the point where the false self, the ego self, the defended self, finally cracks open, and what was always underneath can finally emerge. That emergence, that's the echo. That's God's voice in pain, not explaining the pain, not justifying it, but using the opening it creates to say what couldn't be said before, to the person you couldn't have been before the breaking. Viktor Frankl, the man I mentioned at the beginning, summarized his entire philosophy in one sentence. When we are no longer able to change a situation, We are challenged to change ourselves. But the deeper truth he discovered is that in that change, in that forced transformation, we don't just become different, we become open. And in that openness, the divine, whatever you understand that to mean, finally has access. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and I want you to really sit with it. What if the pain you're carrying right now, the suffering you'd do anything to escape, is actually the very thing creating the space for the encounter you've been unconsciously seeking your entire life? What if running from it means missing the message? And what if the bravest, most spiritual thing you could do isn't to ask for the pain to stop, but to ask, in the middle of it, what are you trying to tell me? The echo is already there. It's been there all along. The question is whether you're ready to stop screaming long enough to hear it. Thank you for watching. See you at the next one.